For the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about the prophets. Now, in this study, I'm not going to be going through a verse-by-verse study like we would if we were just having a class, but I'm going to look at it more in sermon form and take each prophet and try to put them in the proper perspective and give us an idea of what they have to say. And so tonight, of course, is going to be the introduction to the prophets. Now, my problem is, as I start on the introduction to the prophets, I don't have the slightest idea what to say. I don't know how to start. I don't know where would be a good place to get into talking about the prophets. So as a result of that, I decided that I'd talk to you about Mount Redoubt. How many of you, Linda's over here giggling. She's not taking me serious. How many of you know what's happening at Mount Redoubt this afternoon? Okay, I see one hand, I think, something like that. That's not a big deal. Doesn't make any difference. We're going to be talking in just a minute about Mount Redoubt, and I think it might be a good way to introduce us to the prophets. But as we begin to look at the prophets, I want to ask you a question. Now, how many of you are concerned about the economy in the United States today? Seriously, raise your hand if you are. Okay, some of you aren't. Looks like most of you really are. I might say a few words about those that say I'm not concerned. Say, where are you? Where have you been? You see, in looking at this. But as we look around about our nation, we look and you can't turn the TV on unless you hear all of this bad news. Bad news anywhere you look. Even this afternoon, I turned the TV on for just a few minutes, and there is this new senator from Chicago that Blago, appointed, and he's up there now defending himself. And he's up defending himself on this basis, that they're bringing him back up again, and they're saying that he lied when he went before the Senate. And that is, they asked him, did Blagovich ask you for any money? And he said, no, he didn't. Did his brother Robert ask you for any money? No, he didn't. And now they found that his brother Robert asked him for $10,000. Well, he spent this afternoon trying to tell us why that's not a contradiction. That really is not a contradiction. It's an overlooked statement. It's something of this nature. So you scratch your head and you say, what is wrong with our leaders? We look at our leaders around about us and it seems like they don't know how to pay their taxes. They lie every time they turn around. They cheat in various ways. They take bribes. And you look at the judges of the land and you have to shake your head. They've decided they will be the lawmakers instead of judges. And on it goes. You know that as well as I know that. And so we look at ourselves and we say, what has happened to our country? Where are we going? Last November, none of us was really worried about the economy. There was a little blip in there. But now then, nobody on the face of the earth has the solution of what we're going to do about it. And so we look and we say, boy, there's bad news everywhere you look. And there is. Now, God has promised us, through Paul, as he wrote to Timothy, that the man of God is furnished completely unto every good work. That the Bible gives us an answer to how we're to deal with all of these problems. So wouldn't it be nice if we had a place where we could go? And as we began to read in that place, it describes the situation the way we know it. And then it tells us what to do about it. It gives us an answer in that way. As we think about the solution to a problem, we might live in dreamland. I might say, wouldn't it be nice if Helen and I could just go on an island somewhere by ourselves and just leave everybody else behind so we wouldn't have any problems? But I read a story in the Bible about Adam and Eve, and she'd cause me problems, wouldn't she? And you say, well, that's not an answer to that. Well, then you say, well, I tell you what, that may not be an answer to it, but wouldn't it be nice if somehow or another God would just strike everybody dead other than me and my family? And you think about yourself. I just gather my family in the house. God strikes everybody dead, buries them out there so I don't have to worry about it. And I have the whole world to myself, and I don't have to put up with all this nonsense, all of this corruption that is around me everywhere. Well, we read a story in the Bible that God did that one time. When the whole world became so corrupt that every thought and imagination of man's heart was evil continually. Sounds kind of like today, that God then sent the flood and wiped out everybody except Noah and his family. They came out of the ark, and that's the kind of world they had. They had a world where there were no false prophets, there were no corrupt government, there was nobody on this earth to give them any problems, and they start all over again. And then you read the story, and the whole world went corrupt again. Then finally, you say, well, maybe that won't work. But wouldn't it be wonderful if God would just, let's say, take America, and God would say, now, I'm going to deal with America. I'm going to become the president of the United States. I'll deal directly with the Americans, and I'll tell them what to do. I'll tell them where they're making their mistakes. When they make financial errors, I will tell them about it. When they make another kind of error, I will tell them about it. God, I will direct America. Wouldn't that be nice if God would do something like that? Well, God did that. God did that in the nation of Israel. After man had failed God so many times, God called Abraham and says, through thy seed. So he dealt with Abraham. And out of Abraham, he made the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, and he dealt with them. And he was their God. He was their king. He was guiding them. He was telling them what to do. The problem is, they went astray. And they did everything that you can read about in our papers today or see on television. You can't name me one thing that you've seen on television or read in the papers about the corruption that goes on in the world today that I can't go to the Bible and read you the same situation there. We'll go back and we'll take a look at it. And we'll see here's what happened to them. And here's what God said. Now, the beautiful thing about it is that part of the Bible that tells you that are the prophets. Unless we understand the prophets, we can't find those answers. But if we understand the prophets, then we can say, boy, now we're starting to get down to where it's a practical lesson, to where you and I can get some real instruction now. Because we're going to be able to go and read in the Bible where the nation of Israel did certain things. And whenever they do it, God would say, now here, you do this. And if you don't do this, I'm going to do this. And so God guided the nation of Israel through the land. And we have these prophets that are telling us all about this. Now that's the purpose of us studying this particular section in the Bible. In our age of which we're living today, we're living in an age of which everybody, from the president down, will tell you that nobody has seen such a thing as this in America before. And that's true. So they say, will the bailout work? Let me say again, this is not going to be a political lesson. We're not going to be preaching politics, but we're going to be talking about these things that the Bible talks about, and that's what it talks about. Now, as we look at this, they'll all tell you, we've never seen it like this before. Will it work? Well, I hope it works. Well, what about if something else comes along? Will it work? Well, I hope it works. And we see all of these brilliant men, smartest financial men on the face of the earth, and not a single one of them will tell you, I know it will work, and I can show you how it will work. It's always just exactly the opposite. So I want us to understand we're living in a unique age. We're living in an age that other people in our nation have not lived through. Now I need to back up and make a correction there because other generations have lived through it. They have lived through these things, but not to the extent that what we're doing today. To the extent that our country is in today, nobody has ever seen this. In a matter of just a little while, bang, everything seems to fall apart. We are privileged to see leaders on television, a month or 2 months ago, come forth and say, if we don't do something, and we have to do it fast, and we have to do it in the next 3 days, or our banks are going to collapse. So everybody got nervous, and they said, what do we need? He said, $350 billion. They said, here it is. They gave it to him. Now today they're looking for it, and they can't find where it went. But we tried, didn't we? We said, wow. So that was our solution. So then the people that comes along and says that was dumb. Doing something like that was really dumb. What we need is $750 billion or $800 billion. So we gave it to them. Last night, I think it was. So we gave it to them. Will it work? Everybody says, I don't know. But we've got to do something. We've got to do something. See, that's it. That's what the prophets is about. We go back and we say, can I find a situation while God was ruling Israel? Can I find a situation in Israel that's like this? And then I find out what God said about it. And God says, do this or do that. And the whole situation is, yes, we can. We can go back there, and that's something we can be certain about. We can find what God told those people right there. Now, what about Mount Redoubt? I don't know yet, Linda. We'll be coming to that in just a minute, maybe to make an application, Mount Redoubt. What I want to do tonight, I just want to introduce us to the prophets. That's all I want to do. And then next week, then we'll start in on what the prophets said and the application and what we need to do about certain things. But now, as we begin to look at prophets in the Bible, let's look at some unique names that you find in the Old Testament. That is, you find there, it says, Jeremiah, then said they, come and let us devise devices against Jeremiah, for the law shall not perish from the priest, nor counsel from the wise, nor the word from the prophet. Now, I'm not going to go through each one of these things in detail, but I want you to notice there that God says, I have set up certain people, certain offices, certain jobs, certain things people are to do. He said here, if you are a priest, you're to deal with the law. They were to study the law, deal with the law, explain the law. Now then, if you were a wise man, you were to give counsel. That's where they would come to you and they would ask you, what do you think we ought to do about this or that? Somebody would say, well, what does God say? Well, let's go ask the priest. The priest will tell us what God says. Now the wise man will tell us how to go about doing that particular thing. Well, what does a prophet do? Nor the word from the prophet. A prophet was to preach the word of God. He was to go about and preach that word everywhere. That was his job. He was merely, really, a preacher that went about doing that. As you look here, you find the same thing. Now, vision of the prophet. The difference in this and the word is this, that God was guiding the prophets. And God would guide the prophets by giving them a vision. God would speak to them in various ways. And sometimes he'd speak to them directly. And he'd say, Jeremiah, I want you to go here and do this. And I want you to say so and so. Sometimes, not very often, but sometimes, he would speak to them in a dream. And sometimes he'd speak to them in a vision. And a vision appeared to be a revelation of God where he would speak, and it would happen while they were wide awake in the daylight hours. And so Jeremiah, all of a sudden, would see something. He's wide awake, and yet he sees this thing. And best way I can understand it, it would be like having a dream when you were awake. That God now is going to put a movie in his mind. He's going to take the prophet, and the prophet is going to see this movie happening. And God is saying, now this is what will happen. So the prophet might see a great army coming. And the army comes down and conquers a certain nation. And then goes over against another nation. But over there they get conquered themselves. And then they'd go out and they'd preach. Here's what God is going to do. So it was the way that God revealed his word to these men that were called the prophets. When you look at a group that were called elders, these were people that were known as the wisest of the day. Not the oldest of the day, but men of age who had lived long enough to where they should have some wisdom if they're ever going to have it. Now the priest, we've already talked about, his job was to take care of the law, the details of the law. Now here we have the prophets. The prophets here dealt with the word. Now the primary duty of a prophet was to communicate to Israel the divine word. They did predict, I want us to note this, they did predict, and that is foretell future things. But their primary duty was to preach. Now they preached to Israel in order to call them back to God and forewarn them of disaster if they didn't return. And on occasions, they foretold the future, but always they were preaching. And so it said that they were preachers rather than predictors. Now, when we think of prophets, we think of prophets that go about and foretell the future. And so they say, now here's what's going to happen. I'm a prophet. Here's what's going to happen. So they tell. They tell things about happen of Christ. What'll happen to the kingdom? What'll happen here? What'll happen there? We think of them as being able to predict the future under inspiration. And that is foretell the future. Now they did that. They did that. But as you study the prophets, I suppose that 99% of them, I don't know the percentage, haven't looked at it. The vast percentage of what the prophets did was to preach. And they preached to the people and they said, now here's what you need to hear. Here's what God says you're doing. And God says that if you don't quit doing this, God's going to do this. They preached to the people. And then they might come out and might not with foretelling something in the future. They'd say, for in the future, the Christ is going to come. And they'd foretell something in the future. But their primary job was to preach to the people. So we need to start looking at the prophets as Old Testament preachers. Old Testament preachers who preached under inspiration. Then there were the psalmists, and the psalmists were those people who wrote psalms or songs, and so you have your book of Psalms that are there, that's in there. Now, as we look at an introduction to this book, here it is, we find that green line being a line of time. Here we have the Garden of Eden. Thank you, you're very kind. And there's Noah. We see him then coming along. Then we have another thing that's happening, and finally God calls Abraham. Then he calls Moses. Moses rules over Israel and Judah until the Christ comes. His law rules in there. Then after Christ, we have a period of time. And finally down here in Monroe, you and I are down here today. Now, if you start with Christ and you look back 2,000 years, that's about the time Abraham lived and started with the nation of Israel. If you get to Christ and you look ahead 2,000 years, that's about the time we're sitting here in this building right now. So Christ is kind of right in the middle of all of this as far as history is concerned, that is here. Now, back there, they had Old Testament prophets. These Old Testament prophets preached between the years of 900 years before Christ up to about 400 years before Christ. And they were preachers. And the reason that they were set at that period of time, now I want you to note, Abraham lived back at about 2000. But these prophets that you read about in the Bible, they didn't really come on the scene until about 900. You say, why did they come on the scene? They came on the scene. You ready for this? Because Israel looked just like America does today. Israel had degenerated, and they came on the scene with God sending them out to preach and say, now here's what you've done, and here's what's going to happen to you if you don't correct it. Those will be the guys that we're going to go back and take a look at. Now, there are New Testament prophets. The New Testament prophets from 33 AD to about 100 AD. In Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 11, it said, now he set some in the church, first apostles and then prophets. So they had New Testament prophets. What that mean? New Testament preachers who preached under inspiration. They were just preachers, preaching inspired of God. We read about one in Acts 11:27 by the name of Agabus. But those are not the ones we're going to study about. We're going to study about the Old Testament prophets. Now, as we look at the Old Testament prophets, we get an introduction to these works. I'll give you a quote right here. It's taken from Homer Haley, who was a great student of the prophets. And he said, the understanding of the political, social, moral, and religious corruptions faced by the prophets of that day and the way they met those conditions will give courage to the Lord's faithful today. So he said, if you go back and you read about their political situation, what their leaders do, what their judges do, he describes it. And he said the moral and the social and the religious, you look at that, and then you compare it today, and it'll give you courage. Now, I might hasten to say that it's not going to take your fear away. Because when you read about these guys and you see what they had to say, you may tremble in your boots. And in fact, one guy said, I do. I just shake on my inside. My bones quake when I think about what God is getting ready to do. But at least we're going to find this. We're going to find what God says, and we're going to find the answer to what we are to do as a Christian. He said the consequences of Israel's disobedience and understanding of the principle in which God dealt with that disobedience will help one better to read the signs of the time. We can look around and say what's going to happen. He said the reading of one's newspaper, secular magazines, and listening to news reports of the present day world events will take on a new significance. And it will. Never again. Will you ever read these things or look at this with the same viewpoint that you look at it before you study the prophets in here? Now, why are we going way back to those particular books? Because of Mount Redoubt. That's the reason we're going to go back. Just as an illustration, Mount Redoubt right now is smoking, rumbling, shaking in Alaska. And they're looking at it and saying, wow, what's getting ready to happen to it? Well, maybe it might be a good time for those people living around it if they said, what do you think we should do? The people that are affected up there, what do you think we should do? You know, it just might be a good time for those people to go back and study about Mount St. Helens, wouldn't it? And you could say, well, why don't you go back and study about Mount St. Helens? And why don't you study about some of the other mountains? And when you do that and you begin to find that a mountain is rumbling and it's smoking and it's shaking and there's vibrations on the Richter scale, that you better watch out. There can be a big explosion. And if you don't want to die, here's what you better do. Now, if people there ignore that, and they say, this mountain's been here for all these many years, I'm not leaving it. Remember the old guy that was down at Mount St. Helens, and he wasn't about to leave. I'm not going to leave. And now he's buried in about 200 feet of debris that is there. Well, study that if you're living around that mountain. Now, the same thing today over here. We've got these things. Let's go to the book that can tell us a little bit about it. So here we can go back. We can look here at the prophets when we see what the Bible says. We go back and we see, reading those prophets, we can see about the political, moral, religious condition of that nation. Now, don't forget, 1 Corinthians 10:11, Paul said, now these things happened unto them by way of example, and they were written for our admonition upon whom the end of the ages should come. God was gracious enough to give us the prophets. Now, the prophets were not preaching to you and me. The prophets were preaching to Judah and Israel and telling Judah and Israel, now here's what you do. And if you don't, here's what's going to happen. But Paul said he wrote it down. We have it now, so that God was good enough to give it to us as an example upon whom the end of the ages should come. That's us. So we look and we see, when we find ourselves in a situation, what do we do about it? What should we do? The Bible says, use an example. Go back and look at it. How can man turn from God so fast? Sometimes it's just amazing how fast we've done it. And you know, something to learn, at least I've learned, how fast our country has just all of a sudden fallen off of the cliff. What is it, been about 3-4 years ago? Nobody had ever heard of a same-sex marriage. If somebody wanted to talk about it, you would have laughed at them and said that's an impossibility. And just all of a sudden, one day a judge in Massachusetts says that's not fair, and so he rendered the laws changed. That's what we're going to do. So in the last 3 or 4 years, bing, 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 going back and forth. And now then, if you're opposed to that, you're a bigot. Now then, if you're opposed to it, people look at you as you're strange. And then, as I said last November, nobody was really concerned about the economy. Oh, we thought we might have a little blimp, a little recession of some kind. But all of a sudden, in this period of time, we're down now to where nobody has the answer. How fast can it happen? And how did God react to their unfaithfulness? What did he do? See, we need to look at it that way. So today, when either the church or our nation sets or acts the way they acted, how should we expect God to act toward us? Pretty good question, isn't it? And you say, I wonder what God's thinking. I wonder why we're in this situation. I wonder what God tells me to do now as a Christian while I'm living in this nation, that anywhere I look, it's corruption everywhere, and it looks like the economy's falling apart. What does God want me to do as one that fears him? That's why we're going to be talking about these particular things and trying to find some Bible answers to this. Now let's look at a couple present-day examples. We've almost forgotten that one, haven't we? But here it is. A few years ago, that happened. Those planes flew into that building. Now, when those planes flew into that building, some of the TV evangelists, can't think of the one it is now, one of the big guys, he said, you know, this is God punishing America. It's waking us up. Here it is that we've been upholding this homosexuality and we've been doing this. And the news media flew apart. The politicians almost fainted. They jumped all over him. And he backed up and said, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. Now, the fact of the case is he was right. You say, you mean to tell me that God will punish nations like this, give us wake-up calls and so forth? Well, as you go back to Isaiah chapter 10, he talks there about to this Assyrian government, which was going over to conquer Israel. And he has something to say to Assyria, and we might learn it. He said, Ho, Assyrian, the rod of mine anger. He said, now I'm going to use this government, this army, as a rod like a parent would spank a child. He said, the staff in whose hand is mine indignation. God said, I am indignant. I am angry. I've told you and told you and told you and told you, and you won't listen. So Israel, I'm taking over. I'm going to bring this heathen government down upon you. And I'm going to destroy you as a nation. That's God speaking. He said, I will send him against a profane nation. That's Israel. And against the people of my wrath will I give him a charge. I'm wrathful toward you. And he said to take the spoil and take the prey and to tread them down like mire in the street. I'm going to have him to just tear this nation to pieces. And then we get a little glimpse of something that's very interesting. Howbeit he, the Assyrians, meaneth not so, neither does his heart think so. Now, when I use the Assyrians to come and to punish you and to bring problems upon you, that Assyrian nation doesn't have the slightest idea that I, Jehovah God, am causing this to happen. That Assyrian thinks that he is doing that. But God says, that's what I use. I will use people and nations who do not serve me at all, who have nothing to do with me as a God, and I will use them as a stick to give you a spanking. Now, those guys in that nation that flew those planes in there, they weren't trying to help God. They didn't say, let's change our God to serve Jehovah. No. But they sure shook us up, didn't they? But you see, here's a problem. And here's another thing. We didn't learn from that. No, sir, not us. We're too tough. We come back and we say, okay. And we get out and we make speeches. And we'll pursue you until you're dead. And we begin to tell what we're going to do. You don't fool around with a nation like us. And we're still caught up in it, aren't we? Still caught up. And nobody seems to come to the forefront and say, you know, maybe our attitude is not right. Maybe we need to rethink some of these things. So now, we take a look at this and we say, okay, that's what happened there. Now then, let's look at another example that we've got, and that is today. Financial collapse, depression looking upon us. You say, you mean to tell me, Lowell, that there are depressions in the Old Testament? Well, look at Habakkuk. As he tells about the nation as it's getting ready to go into captivity, he said, though the fig tree shall not flourish. Now, I want you to think these things don't mean too much to you and me, because you don't depend on a fig tree or a grapevine or an olive tree, but that's their staple. That's where you see it everywhere around over there in that nation. That's their staples that kept them alive. But he said, the day's coming when your fig tree is not going to flourish. Neither shall the fruit in the vines. You won't have any figs, and you're not going to have any grapes on the vines. The labor of the olive shall fail. You're not going to have any olive oil, anything of that nature. And the field shall yield no food. You go out and plow your field, there won't be any crops. And the flock shall be cut off from the fold. Those flocks that are out there, that you see the shepherds running the sheep and going out and then bringing them in, they're all going to be just cut off and scattered. They're not going to be coming. You're going to lose all of them. And then he says, and there shall be no herd in the stall. You're not going to have anything in your barns that you have penned up. They're going to get out. You think that might be a depression? When a nation here that depends on these things, these are their 401ks. These are their cornfields. These are their food supply. And the prophet says, the day's coming when you ain't going to have any. Now tonight we're not going to talk about what he said, but he tells us what to do. He tells us what's okay to do. And he tells us what to do. That's the reason we're going to be studying the prophets. What was a prophet? What did they do? My time's running out. These things right here are not really important that are here. But I want to get in here about the prophets to see this. How many prophets are there? What is the difference between a major and a minor prophet? Well, mankind has classified the prophets into two groups. As he's done this, there are 5 major prophets. They say major prophets. There are 5 books. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And then there are 12 that we say are minor prophets. Then, as we look at this, 17, we say, what's the difference? And the answer is nothing. Not one difference. Not one difference in the whole thing. The only difference that you can find is that your major prophets are generally longer books than your minor prophets. But that's not consistent all the way through. Your minor prophets are more of your shorter books. They're the ones we'll zero in on. Your major prophets are your longer books of several chapters. But they're all just the same, talking about exactly the same thing. So here's what we need to do. We need to think of the prophets as human beings. The prophets were all men living, some living at one time, some at another. There are 17 books written by these prophets. 12 of these books are minor, and 5 of them are major. It's only an arbitrary thing that I just got through explaining that are in there. But I want us to notice this. When we start thinking about prophets, Don't think about books in the Old Testament. Now, the books in the Old Testament are there, 17 of them, and they're named after the guy who wrote them. But when we think about a prophet, we think about a Haggai or a Jeremiah. So oftentimes we think, oh yeah, I know where that is. That's a book that is in here. Well, it is the name of a book. But the prophet was a human being. A prophet was a man that God called and said, I want you to go do a job for me. And we want to get acquainted with them so that we understand them. So that if you talk about them, you can get a feeling, yeah, I know what he's like. So that when you get to heaven and somebody says, oh, there's Amos, you'll say, oh, and you'll know about Amos. If somebody said, oh, there's Hosea, oh, that poor fella, and you go over and start talking to him, you know them. That's what we want to get acquainted with as we're studying this in here. Now, the meaning of a prophet. The meaning of a prophet, and again, I'm going to go through this because I can tell you about this in one chart that's up here. What is a prophet? Well, in Exodus 7:1, God called Moses and told him, he said, now I want you to go down and talk to Pharaoh. Moses said, I can't do it. I stutter. I'm not a fluent speaker. And Jehovah said unto Moses, see, I have made thee as God. Keep that in mind. To Pharaoh. Now, when you go down to talk to Pharaoh, you're going to be talking to him as God talks to him. You're going to be given the orders. And Aaron thy brother shall be thy prophet. So I'm going to send Aaron with you. And you're going to command Aaron, and Aaron will talk to Moses. Talk to Pharaoh. So here it is, Moses, you're going to stand there as the authority. And you're going to talk to Aaron, and Aaron will tell Pharaoh. You're going to be as God. He's going to be your prophet. Now, it's an interesting thing because over in the 4th chapter, in verse 16, he talks about the same thing. And he, that's Aaron, he shall be thy spokesman unto the people, and it shall come to pass, he shall be to thee a mouth, and thou shalt be to him as God. What is a prophet? A prophet is the mouth of God. Here it is that Moses is here to speak to Pharaoh. Oh, here's Aaron. Aaron doesn't have the slightest idea what's going to be said. Moses will turn to Aaron and say, Aaron, you tell him did. Aaron will turn, and Aaron will speak those words. He'll use his mouth to speak to Pharaoh. And so Aaron is a mouth. Moses was the authority. That's what a prophet is. A prophet is a mouthpiece of God, one that speaks in behalf of God. Now, there's different categories. There are oral prophets, pre-literary prophets, that is, prophets that prophesied before these prophets came on, but they didn't write any books. Then there are literary prophets. These are the guys who wrote the books, 17 of them. And then there are the false prophets that you run across. And you can take those false prophets, and it's kind of interesting. You can break them down into two groups. Some of those false prophets, they prophesied for money. Another group prophesied for political favor, so that the king would give them a high position in government. But they were all false prophets that was in there. So now, next week, we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about the historical background, and again, I'm going to rush right here in this. But we're going to talk about that historical background. That's what's going to be all about it. But now get ready for one of the most exciting Bible studies you've ever had. If you really will read your Bible. Not because I'm an exciting speaker, but because of what we're going to see in the Bible. What we learn in this class will forever change the way we look at world events. Never again will you ever look at them the same. The teaching of these men will cause us never again to read the newspaper, watch TV, the way we have in the past. Your whole idea, your whole philosophy is going to be changed. About 2 or 3 months ago, I got a call from a lady in Florida. Many of you know her, Sue Snobble. I haven't seen her, heard of her for over 40 years. And so Sue was asking me a Bible question. And then she said, Lowell, she said, you remember back when we were studying the prophets? And when you were preaching on those prophets? She said, it looks like we're there now, doesn't it? And I thought, that's something. Here's a woman that hadn't forgotten it. 40 years. And she's still looking. And she's seeing the change that's coming in our nation. Now, putting the teaching of these prophets in our mind is like putting on a new set of glasses. We'll be able to see things we've never seen before. You will. You're going to see things, you say, I never thought about that. I see now some of these things that's happened. So it'll be a blessing, and it'll give us a degree of comfort that we've never known before, because we're living in a very strange time. But should you be here tonight and you understand your life is not right with God, and if you need to make it right, either to be baptized into Christ or confess your sins, one to the other, would you do so as we stand and sing the first verse of this